I thought staying at my best friend Josh's house for the weekend would be just like old times, movies, jokes, and late-night gaming. But everything changed when I heard a soft knock on my guest room door at 1 a.m. I wasn't prepared for who was on the other side or what they would say. That night, Josh's mom didn't just cross the doorway, she crossed a line that left me questioning everything. Josh and I had been best friends since middle school. We were inseparable, partners in crime, brothers from different mothers. His house was practically my second home, and his parents, especially his mom, Melanie, treated me like family. Melanie was the kind of woman who could light up a room. She had this calming presence, always smiling, always warm. Whether it was her infectious laughter or the way she made everyone feel at ease, she was the kind of person you'd always want around. Josh's dad worked out of town a lot, so Melanie often played both parent roles, and she did it effortlessly. That weekend, things started out like any other visit. Josh and I spent hours at the park playing basketball, though he beat me every time. By the time we got back to his place, we were both exhausted. Melanie welcomed us with pizza and joined us for a couple of action movies. She laughed at our jokes, even the bad ones, and shared a few stories of her own. It felt like one of those perfect, ordinary nights. As the evening wore on, Josh called it a night and headed upstairs to his room. I was staying in the guest room downstairs, a cozy little space I had become well acquainted with over the years. I wasn't particularly tired, so I stayed up scrolling through my phone. The house grew quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I'd always admired the sense of comfort and safety Josh's house provided. No drama, no tension, just an escape from the chaos of the outside world. But that night, something shifted. Around 1 a.m., just as I was beginning to drift off, there was a soft knock on the door. I froze, unsure if I'd imagined it. The house was so still that even the faintest sound seemed amplified. And then I heard her voice, gentle, hesitant. "Hey, you still awake?" It was Melanie. I didn't know why she was at my door at that hour or what she wanted, but as I sat up to respond, something about the moment felt different, an unspoken tension I couldn't quite place. As Melanie stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted. She was wearing a loose cardigan over her pajamas, her hair tied back casually. Her expression was warm, but there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite read. "Sorry to bother you," she said softly, lingering near the door. "I just wanted to check if you were comfortable." "Need anything?" Her tone was casual, but her timing was anything but. Why was she checking on me now, at this hour? I shook off the unease and managed a smile. "No, I'm good." "Thanks, Melanie." She smiled back, stepping further into the room. "Good. I just wanted to say, thank you." "Thank me?" I asked, confused. "For being such a good friend to Josh. You've been there for him in ways I can't always be, especially with his dad away so much. It means a lot to us, more than you know." Her words caught me off guard, and I felt a faint flush creep into my cheeks. "Oh, it's nothing. Josh is like a brother to me." Her smile lingered, soft and almost wistful. She took a step closer, and I noticed the way her gaze lingered on me just a moment too long. There was nothing overtly inappropriate, yet the room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. "Well, I'll let you rest," she said after a moment, turning to leave. But before she stepped out, she glanced back, her eyes locking with mine. "Good night," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good night," I replied, still trying to process the odd encounter. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept circling back to her, her tone, the way she looked at me, the way she lingered. Was I reading too much into it? Or was there something more to her words and actions than met the eye? The next morning, Melanie's cheerful demeanor returned as if nothing unusual had happened. She greeted me and Josh with her usual warmth, her smile as bright as ever. But I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes seemed to linger on me during breakfast or the faint tension I felt whenever she was nearby. By the afternoon, Josh had stepped out to meet some friends, leaving me alone in the house with Melanie. I tried to keep myself busy, flipping through channels on the TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt quieter than usual, almost unnervingly so. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard her footsteps coming down the stairs. "Still here?" she asked, her voice playful as she walked into the living room. "Yeah," I said, sitting up straighter. "Josh ran out for a bit." She nodded, settling into the armchair across from me. She held a mug of tea in her hands, her movements relaxed but deliberate. "You didn't feel like going with him?" "Not really. Just wasn't in the mood." She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "You seem quieter than usual. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." She nodded, though her eyes stayed on me, searching. "You know, you're welcome to make yourself at home here. I hope you know that." "I do." "Thanks," I said quickly, feeling a faint flush rise to my face. Her gaze lingered for a moment longer before she smiled and took another sip of her tea. The silence between us felt heavier than it should have, as though something unspoken was hanging in the air. Just as I was about to excuse myself and retreat to the guest room, she leaned forward slightly, her expression soft but serious. "Can I be honest with you about something?" she asked, her voice low. Her question lingered in the air, her tone laced with a seriousness I hadn't expected. I nodded slowly, unsure of where this was going, but too curious to stop her. "Of course," I said, my voice steady despite the faint unease stirring inside me. Melanie leaned back slightly, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her mug as she spoke. "You've been such a constant presence in Josh's life, and in ours. Sometimes I wonder if we rely on you too much." I blinked, caught off guard by her words. "I don't feel that way," I said quickly. "I like being here. You and Josh have always made me feel welcome." Her smile returned, but there was a depth to it that made my chest tighten. "You've always been mature for your age," she said softly. "Sometimes I forget you're still so young. You carry yourself with so much grace." I shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. "I've had good role models," I said, hoping to steer the conversation to safer ground. She chuckled lightly, the sound warm but tinged with something deeper. "That's kind of you to say," she replied, her gaze meeting mine and holding it. "But I think you deserve more credit than you give yourself." The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with an intensity one couldn't quite place. My heart raced as her words hung in the air, their weight sinking into me. I searched for something to say, anything to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Melanie set her mug down on the coffee table and leaned forward slightly, her posture relaxed but her eyes intent. "Do you ever feel like people expect too much from you?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes," I admitted. "It's like, I don't want to let anyone down, but it's hard to balance everything." Her expression softened, and she reached out, placing a hand lightly on mine. "I'm sorry if we've ever made you feel that way," she said. "You're a wonderful person, and I hope you know how much you mean to us, to me." The warmth of her touch sent a jolt through me, and I forced myself to stay still. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Her hand lingered on mine, her fingers brushing lightly against my skin. My thoughts were racing, every logical part of me screaming to pull away, but I couldn't. The room felt smaller, the air heavier as the silence stretched between us. Finally, she broke the stillness, her voice low and measured. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," she said. "Sometimes it's easy to feel lost when things get too quiet." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising to my face. She was close now, closer than she'd ever been, and the unspoken tension between us was impossible to ignore. "I'm fine," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. Her gaze held mine, her eyes searching as though she could see straight through me. "You don't seem fine," she said gently. "You're usually so at ease here, but today, you're different." "I guess I'm just in my head," I said, forcing a small smile. "Nothing serious." She studied me for a moment longer before leaning back, her expression thoughtful. "You know, you've always brought something special to this house," she said softly. "It's not the same without you." Her words sent a shiver through me, and I shifted slightly, glancing toward the clock as if it might offer me an escape. "I should probably head back to the guest room," I said, standing up abruptly. "Josh will be back soon." "Of course," she said, though her eye stayed on me as I moved toward the hallway. "Let me know if you need anything." "I will," I said, giving her a small wave before retreating to the safety of the guest room. Back in the room, I leaned against the door and exhaled slowly, my heart still racing. The intensity of the moment lingered, the memory of her touch and her words replaying in my mind. I sank onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as I tried to make sense of it all. But I didn't have long to process. Just as I was starting to calm down, there was another knock at the door, firmer this time, but still hesitant. My chest tightened as I sat up, my eyes fixed on the door. "Come in," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The door opened slowly, and there she was again, standing in the doorway with her gaze steady and unreadable. This time, there was no pretense of casualness. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, her tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of something I couldn't place. "No, not at all," I said quickly, sitting up straighter. "What's up?" She hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, her movements deliberate. "I've been thinking about what I said earlier," she began, her voice quiet. "And there's something else I need to say." Melanie stood there for a moment, her expression unreadable as her gaze met mine. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, and my heart pounded in my chest. She took a step closer, her movement slow and deliberate, her presence commanding the room. I didn't know what to expect, but I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "I've always admired how close you and Josh are," she began, her voice soft but steady. "It's rare to see such a strong bond between friends." I nodded, unsure of where she was going with this. "Josh is like a brother to me," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. She smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving mine. "And you've become like family to us. I hope you know how much you mean to me, to all of us." Her words were warm, but there was a depth to her tone that made my chest tighten. I tried to focus on my breathing, willing myself to stay calm, but the intensity of her presence made it impossible to relax. "I appreciate that," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She took another step closer, her movements careful but deliberate. "Sometimes," she continued, "I feel like we don't say it enough. How much we rely on you. How much I rely on you." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a faint flush rise to my face. "You've always been so kind to me," I said quickly, hoping to steer the conversation back to safer territory. "I'm glad I can help." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze soft but intense. "It's more than that," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You're not just a part of Josh's life. You're a part of mine, too." The room felt smaller, the silence between us heavy and charged. I searched for something to say, anything to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there, frozen, as she took another step closer, her eyes locked on mine. "You've grown up so much," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of warmth and something else I couldn't quite place. "It's hard to believe you're the same boy who used to run around this house with Josh, laughing and causing chaos." I managed a small smile, though my heart was racing. "I guess we all grow up eventually," I said, my voice strained. She nodded, her gaze lingering on me. "You've grown into someone I deeply admire," she said softly. "And I need you to know how much that means to me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I struggled to process what she was saying. There was something in her tone, something in the way she was looking at me, that made my head spin. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand, and I didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "That means a lot." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and she reached out, her hand brushing lightly against mine. The warmth of her touch sent a jolt through me, and I forced myself to stay still, even as my pulse thundered in my ears. "I hope I'm not overstepping," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed to tell you how I feel." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I tried to find the right words. "It's okay," I said finally, though my voice wavered. "I'm glad you told me." Her gaze held mine, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had fallen away. The only thing that existed was the two of us, standing there in the quiet of the room, the tension between us palpable. And then, before I could fully process what was happening, she leaned in. Her movements were slow, deliberate, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, my mind racing as her lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, but it sent a shockwave through me. I didn't know how to react, didn't know what to do. All I knew was that the world felt like it had tilted on its axis, and nothing would ever be the same. When she pulled back, her gaze searched mine, her expression a mix of uncertainty and something deeper. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have done that." I shook my head, struggling to find my voice. It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. She stepped back, her movements hesitant, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air between us. "I should go," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Josh will be back soon." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. She turned and walked to the door, her steps quiet against the floor. But just before she stepped out, she glanced back, her eyes meeting mine one last time. "Good night," she said softly, her tone laced with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "Good night," I replied, my voice strained. The door clicked shut behind her, and I was left alone in the room, my thoughts swirling with everything that had just happened. My heart was still racing, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. I didn't know what to think, didn't know how to make sense of the moment. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The morning after was strangely quiet. The house that had always been filled with warmth and familiarity now felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. I woke up groggy, my mind still replaying the events of the previous night. Every glance, every word, every touch, it all swirled in my thoughts like a storm I couldn't escape. I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen, hoping that coffee might help clear my head. Melanie was already there, leaning against the counter with her mug in hand. She looked up when she heard me enter, her usual warm smile spreading across her face as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," she said, her tone light and cheerful. "Morning," I mumbled, trying to avoid her gaze as I poured myself a cup of coffee. My hands felt unsteady, and I was acutely aware of every move I made under her watchful eyes. Josh's footsteps thundered down the stairs, breaking the tension that had been building between us. He burst into the kitchen, his usual energy filling the space. "You look like you didn't sleep at all," he said, laughing as he grabbed a piece of toast from the counter. "Yeah, I didn't sleep great," I replied, grateful for the distraction he provided. Melanie chimed in with a teasing comment about Josh's bedhead, and for a moment, things felt almost normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that her gaze lingered on me just a second too long. As the day went on, I tried to act like everything was fine. Josh and I fell into our usual rhythm of playing video games and joking around, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time Melanie entered the room, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. She was perfectly composed, her demeanor warm and welcoming as always, but I couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in her tone and the way her eyes would flicker toward me. By mid-afternoon, Josh decided to head out to grab something he'd forgotten the day before. "You wanna come?" he asked, tossing his car keys in the air. "Nah, I'll hang here," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. The thought of being alone with him felt overwhelming, like I wouldn't be able to hide the storm raging inside me. "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug, heading out the door. And just like that, the house grew quiet again. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to Melanie, her words, her touch, the kiss. It was impossible to ignore the weight of what had happened and the lingering tension it had created. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. They were soft, measured, growing louder as she approached the living room. She stepped inside, her expression calm but unreadable, and my pulse quickened. "Still here?" she asked, her voice light. "Yeah," I replied, sitting up straighter. "Josh went out for a bit." She nodded, settling into the armchair across from me. "I thought I'd take a break too," she said, her tone casual. "It's nice to have the house a little quieter sometimes." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we weren't addressing. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something, and I didn't know how to pull myself back. "You've been quieter today," she said, breaking the silence. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. She studied me for a moment, her gaze soft but searching. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said gently. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me." I hesitated, my thoughts racing. I wanted to confront the situation, to ask her what last night meant, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "I'm just tired." Her expression didn't change, but I could see the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. She nodded slowly, leaning back in her chair. "I understand," she said, her tone calm but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. The conversation drifted to safer topics, but the tension between us remained. Every glance, every pause felt weighted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both walking a fine line. When Josh returned, his usual energy filled the house once more, and I was relieved for the distraction. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of noise and movement, but I couldn't fully relax. Every time Melanie entered the room, I felt a pang of unease, a reminder of the line we had crossed and the consequences it might bring. As the night wore on, I found myself retreating to the guest room earlier than usual. I needed space, a chance to clear my head and figure out what to do next. But as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the situation pressed down on me, making it impossible to sleep. I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The events of the past day had set something in motion, and there was no going back to the way things were. All I could do now was brace myself for whatever came next. The days that followed were a blur of unease and introspection. I left Josh's house that weekend feeling like I had stepped out of one world and into another, one where the boundaries I thought were unshakable had been blurred, if not completely erased. My thoughts were a tangled mess, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't seem to untangle them. Back home, I spent hours replaying the events in my head. Every word, every glance, every moment between Melanie and me felt magnified, as though my mind was dissecting it for some deeper meaning. Was it an innocent mistake born out of a lapse in judgment? Or was it something far more complicated and dangerous? I couldn't escape the guilt that clung to me like a shadow. Josh was my best friend, the closest thing I had to a brother. His trust in me was unwavering, and I had betrayed it, not in action, perhaps, but in thought and intent. The realization was a hard pill to swallow, and it gnawed at me relentlessly. I thought about Melanie too, about what her actions meant and why she had crossed the line. She had always been kind and caring, a source of comfort and stability. But now, her warmth felt like a double-edged sword, cutting deeper than I ever thought possible. Did she regret what had happened? Or had it meant something to her, something she couldn't say out loud? Weeks passed, and I avoided going back to Josh's house. When he asked why, I made excuses: schoolwork, family obligations, anything to keep a safe distance. I didn't trust myself to face Melanie again, to pretend like nothing had happened when the memory of that night lingered in my mind like an unresolved question. Eventually, Josh noticed. "Is something going on?" he asked one afternoon, his tone filled with concern. "You've been weird lately." I forced a laugh, brushing off his question with a casual excuse. But the truth weighed heavy on my chest, a secret I could never share. Telling him would destroy everything: our friendship, his family, his trust in me. Keeping it to myself felt like the only option, even if it tore me apart inside. Through it all, one thought stayed with me: every choice we make has consequences. Crossing certain lines, no matter how tempting, can shatter the foundations we've built. Melanie's actions, and my inability to stop them, had created a ripple effect that I couldn't control, one that had forever changed the dynamic between us. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could learn from it. I resolved to set boundaries, to be more aware of the situations I allowed myself to be in and the relationships I nurtured. Melanie's kindness had always been a source of comfort, but it had crossed into something else, something that shouldn't have happened. And I needed to ensure it never happened again. Months later, when I finally visited Josh's house again, things felt different. Melanie greeted me with her usual warmth, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired and a mutual understanding that it wouldn't happen again. We didn't speak of that night, and I didn't need to. Some things were better left unsaid. As time went on, the memory of that weekend faded, but the lessons it taught me remained. Trust is fragile, boundaries are essential, and every action has a ripple effect that can impact the lives of those around us. In the end, I realized that the most important relationships are the ones built on honesty, respect, and mutual understanding. And no fleeting moment of temptation is worth destroying the things and people you hold most dear. What would you do if you found yourself in my position? Would you risk everything for a fleeting moment, or walk away to protect the people you care about most? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm curious to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. You won't want to miss the next shocking tale.